Eleanor Shaw stood on the auction block, wrists bound and dignity stripped away, as men bid on her like cattle, until a quiet cowboy stepped forward and offered everything he owned to save a woman he'd never met. The sale of one human being to another should have been her end, but instead it became the beginning of a love story that would change the fate of an entire valley. The auction block felt hard and unforgiving beneath Eleanor Shaw as she perched there like some prized mare, the rough wood digging into her skin through the thin fabric of her dress. The setting sun cast long shadows across Redemption's dusty main street, painting the crowd of men in shades of amber and gold. Their hungry eyes crawled over her, assessing, calculating what she might be worth. Eleanor kept her chin high, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. $500! The auctioneer's voice boomed across the hushed crowd. Do I hear $550 for this fine young woman, educated in Boston, can read and write, cook and clean, a proper lady to bring civilization to your homestead, gentlemen? Eleanor felt bile rise in her throat. 3 weeks ago, she had been traveling west by stagecoach to take a teaching position in Santa Fe. Then the attack came. Bandits who killed the driver and the other passengers. They'd spared her only to sell her to a band of outlaws, who in turn had brought her here to this god-forsaken town on the edge of nowhere. With no family to search for her and no money to her name, she had become merchandise. $600, called a voice from the crowd. Eleanor recognized him, the owner of the saloon, a man with wandering hands and whiskey-soured breath who had leered at her when they'd brought her into town. $700, another voice, this one belonging to a cattle baron whose reputation for cruelty toward his workers was legendary, even in the short time she'd been held in this town. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, trying to still the trembling in her hands. The ropes around her wrists chafed as she shifted slightly, searching for any weakness in her bindings. There was none. $800. The auctioneer sounded pleased, his commission growing with each bid. This fine, educated lady can bear sons, mend your clothes, read to you on cold winter nights. Do I hear 9? The crowd murmured. In a place where most men lived hard, brutal lives with few comforts, the prospect of claiming a woman like Eleanor, with her porcelain skin, auburn hair, and refined manners, was driving the bidding higher than anyone had anticipated. $1,000. The new voice cut through the crowd, quiet but firm. The crowd parted, and Eleanor saw him for the first time. He stood at the edge of the gathering, leaning against a hitching post with a casual ease that belied the tension in his shoulders. Unlike the others, his gaze met hers directly, not as property to be claimed, but as a human being trapped in an impossible situation. His face was weathered by sun and wind, partially hidden beneath the shadow of his hat. A thin scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into the collar of his faded blue shirt. The auctioneer's eyebrows shot up. $1,000 from Mr. Wyatt. Do I hear 1,100? The saloon keeper spat in the dirt. 1,100. 12. Counted the cattle baron, his meaty fists clenching. Eleanor watched the quiet man, Wyatt, whose expression remained impassive. Something about him struck her as different from the others. He stood apart, not just physically, but in some fundamental way she couldn't quite define. 1,500. Wyatt said, his voice still calm, but carrying clearly across the now silent square. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. $1,500 was a fortune in these parts, the price of a good parcel of land or a sizable herd. The auctioneer's eyes widened. $1,500. Going once. 2,000. Growled the cattle baron, his face flushing red with anger and pride. Wyatt finally pushed himself away from the hitching post, taking a step forward into the light. Everything I own, the auctioneer faltered. What's that? Mr. Wyatt, everything I own, he repeated, reaching into his coat to pull out a folded document. My deed to the Shadow Rock Ranch, 160 acres, the cabin, the barn, the spring, the cattle and horses, everything. The crowd buzzed with shock. Shadow Rock was known to be modest but prosperous, good water, decent grazing land, well maintained, plus This. He tossed a pouch that landed with a heavy clink at the auctioneer's feet. 2,000 in gold, everything I have. The auctioneer looked stunned, bending to verify the contents of the pouch. Mr. Wyatt, surely you don't mean... I do. His eyes never left Eleanor's. For the first time since the nightmare began, Eleanor felt something other than despair stirring in her chest. Not hope. She'd beaten that emotion into submission days ago, but curiosity. What kind of man would trade everything he owned for a stranger? The cattle baron cursed loudly, but stepped back. No one could match the offer, and everyone knew it. Sold! The auctioneer's gavel came down with a crack that seemed to echo across the mountains. Did the woman goes to Caleb Wyatt. 2 men untied her from the auction block, but left her wrists bound. They led her through the parting crowd to stand before her new owner. Up close, she could see his eyes, grey like storm clouds, with something unreadable behind them. Mr. Wyatt, the sheriff said, slapping him on the back. Quite a purchase, though I reckon you'll want to keep her tied until you get her home. These eastern fillies can be spirited. Eleanor stiffened, anger flaring despite her exhaustion. That won't be necessary, Wyatt said quietly, pulling a knife from his belt. Eleanor flinched involuntarily, but instead of threatening her, he carefully slid the blade between her wrists, cutting the rope with a swift upward motion. The bindings fell away, and she rubbed her raw skin, watching him warily. No, she's not a horse, he said, returning the knife to his belt. She can walk beside me of her own accord, the sheriff shrugged. Your property, your choice, but don't come crying when she runs first chance she gets. Wyatt didn't respond, instead turning to Eleanor. My wagon's this way, Miss Shaw, she said, her voice rough from disuse. Eleanor Shaw, he nodded once. Miss Shaw, if you'll follow me. As they walked away from the auction block, the crowd dispersed, some men casting envious glances their way, others shaking their heads at Wyatt's apparent foolishness. Eleanor matched his stride, her mind racing. Was he her savior? Or merely a different kind of captor? What did he intend to do with her? And why would anyone sacrifice everything they owned for a woman they'd never met? The wagon waited at the end of the street, a sturdy workhorse standing patiently in the traces. Wyatt helped her up onto the seat, his touch impersonal, but not rough, then climbed up beside her. Why? The question escaped her lips before she could stop it. He gathered the reins in his hands, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. Nobody deserves to be sold like cattle. You just gave up your entire life. A muscle tightened in his jaw. Some prices are worth paying. As the wagon pulled away from redemption, Eleanor stared at the man beside her, trying to unravel the mystery of Caleb Wyatt, wondering if she'd just been rescued or if she'd simply traded one form of captivity for another. The sun sank below the horizon, and darkness fell across the land as they headed toward an uncertain future. The wagon creaked and swayed as it navigated the rutted trail leading away from town. Eleanor gripped the wooden seat, her knuckles white, watching the lights of redemption fade into the darkness behind them. Her body ached from days of rough treatment, and exhaustion pulled at her like quicksand, but she forced herself to stay alert. Freedom might still be possible if she could just find the right moment to run. It's a 2-hour ride, Wyatt said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since leaving town. You can rest if you need to. I won't let you fall. Eleanor straightened her spine. I prefer to stay awake, Mr. Wyatt. His eyes remained on the trail ahead, lit only by a sliver of moon and the lantern hanging from the wagon. Suit yourself. The night air grew colder as they climbed into the foothills, and Eleanor couldn't suppress a shiver. Without comment, Wyatt shrugged out of his coat and handed it to her, still keeping his attention on the horses and the path ahead. She hesitated, pride warring with practical need. Take it, he said quietly. Nights get cold here, different from Boston. Eleanor accepted the coat, draping it around her shoulders. It carried his scent, leather, wood smoke, and something clean like sage. How did you know I'm from Boston? Auctioneer mentioned it. Said you were educated there. And you believed that? The corner of his mouth twitched slightly. Was it a lie? No, she admitted. I attended the Boston Female Seminary. I was traveling to Santa Fe to take a position as a school teacher when our stagecoach was attacked. He nodded once, acknowledging her story without pushing for details she wasn't ready to share. The silence returned, but it felt less brittle now, as if some small understanding had formed between them. As the wagon rolled on, Eleanor studied her unlikely rescuer in the dim light. Caleb Wyatt carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. His hands on the reins were strong but gentle, guiding the horses with subtle movements. He wasn't handsome in the conventional way of the men she'd known in Boston. Those clean-shaven gentlemen with soft hands and cultivated manners. There was something unpolished about him, yet not unkind. "Why were you in town today?" she asked finally. "Supplies," he answered. "Feed for the winter. Tools. Not to buy a woman." His jaw tightened. "No, yet you spent everything you had." "Why?" Wyatt was silent for so long that Eleanor thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Some things a man can't stand by and watch. That doesn't explain sacrificing your ranch. Land can be claimed again. Cattle can be bred. A person's dignity." He trailed off, then finished simply, "Can't stand by and watch." Eleanor wrapped his coat tighter around herself, processing his words. If what he said was true, if he truly meant to restore her dignity rather than claim her for himself, then perhaps she had found something rarer than a rescuer. Perhaps she had found a good man in a place where such things seemed impossible. But experience had taught her that good intentions often masked darker desires. She wouldn't let her guard down until she knew for certain what kind of man Caleb Wyatt truly was. The trail began to descend, winding through a stand of pines that gave way to a small valley. In the moonlight, Eleanor could make out the silhouette of a modest cabin nestled against the hillside, smoke curling from its chimney. A barn stood nearby, and beyond it stretched fenced pastures where dark shapes, cattle, she presumed, huddled together for warmth. "Shadow Rock," Wyatt said, nodding toward the homestead, "named for the way the shadows play on that rock face at sunset." He pointed to a cliff that loomed above the cabin, its surface smooth and pale in the moonlight. Despite her wariness, Eleanor felt a pang of regret. This was his home, the place he had built with his own hands. If the calluses she'd noticed were any indication, and he had traded it all for her. "There's someone there," she observed, noticing movement on the cabin porch. "My foreman, Jake Pullman, and his wife, Sarah." Wyatt slowed the horses as they approached. "They live in the small cabin beyond the barn." As the wagon came to a stop before the main house, the door opened, spilling warm light onto the porch. A tall, lanky man with a shock of grey-streaked hair stepped out, followed by a stout woman wiping her hands on her apron. "Caleb, thank heavens!" the woman called. "We were getting worried. Jake was about to ride into town after you." "Got delayed, Sarah," Wyatt replied, setting the brake and climbing down from the wagon. He came around to Eleanor's side and offered his hand to help her down. She hesitated, then accepted, allowing him to steady her as her feet touched the ground. After days of being manhandled and bound, his careful touch was a stark contrast. "This is Miss Eleanor Shaw," Wyatt said as the couple approached. "Miss Shaw, this is Jake and Sarah Pullman." Eleanor nodded stiffly, uncertain how to navigate this introduction. Was she a guest, a servant, property? Sarah's eyes widened as she took in Eleanor's appearance. The fine but dirty dress, the bruises on her wrists, the exhaustion evident in her posture. Understanding dawned in the older woman's face. "You poor dear," she said, stepping forward and taking Eleanor's arm. "Come inside where it's warm. You look dead on your feet." Eleanor glanced at Wyatt, who gave a small nod. "Go on. Sarah will see to your needs." "And you, Caleb?" Jake asked, his weathered face creased with concern. "Town treating you right. We need to talk," Wyatt replied, his voice too low for Eleanor to hear clearly as Sarah ushered her toward the cabin. The interior was simple but welcoming. A large main room with a stone fireplace, a wooden table with chairs, a small kitchen area with an iron stove, and doors leading to what she presumed were bedrooms. Everything was clean and orderly, with handmade quilts adding color to the otherwise practical furnishings. "Sit by the fire," Sarah instructed, pulling out a chair. "I'll heat some stew and fetch water for washing." Too tired to protest, Eleanor sank into the chair. The warmth of the fire began to thaw the chill that had settled in her bones over the past few weeks. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah paused in her bustling to look at Eleanor directly. "No need for thanks, child. Whatever happened to bring you here, you're safe now." "Am I?" Eleanor couldn't keep the question from escaping. The older woman's expression softened. "Caleb Wyatt is the finest man in these territories. If he brought you here, It was to help, not to harm. He bought me, Eleanor said bluntly, at auction, like livestock. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Sweet mercy, she whispered. Then gathering herself, she continued more firmly. Well, whatever he paid, it wasn't to own you. That's not who he is. Before Eleanor could respond, the door opened and Wyatt entered with Jake. Both men fell silent when they saw the women talking by the fire. Sarah, Jake said gently, we need a moment with Miss Shaw. Sarah nodded, patting Eleanor's shoulder before retreating to the kitchen area, still within sight but giving them some privacy. Wyatt pulled out a chair and sat across from Eleanor, placing a folded document on the table between them. She recognized it as the deed he had surrendered at the auction. This still has my name on it, he said quietly. The transfer wasn't recorded. It will be tomorrow. Eleanor stared at the paper, confusion clouding her thoughts. I don't understand. It will be transferred to you, Wyatt said, his grey eyes meeting hers steadily. This place, all of it. Eleanor felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her. To me. But why would you? Because it's the only way to ensure your freedom, he replied simply. A woman alone has few rights in these territories. But a woman with property, that's different. Jake cleared his throat. What Caleb's trying to say, miss, is that he's giving you a choice, one you were denied in town today. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she reached for the deed, half expecting it to vanish like a mirage. The paper felt real enough beneath her touch, weathered edges, official stamps, Caleb Wyatt's name inscribed in formal script. She looked up, searching his face for any sign of deception. I don't understand, she said again. No one gives away everything they own to a stranger. It's not a gift, Wyatt replied, his voice steady. It's restitution. For what? You've done me no harm. Not me personally. His eyes flickered to the fire. But men like those in town, men who think a person can be bought and sold. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I've seen too much of that. Couldn't watch it happen again. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, the exhaustion she'd been fighting threatening to overwhelm her. So this is what? Charity? Salvation? Justice? Jake interjected, his voice gruff. Caleb's always had a powerful sense of it. Wyatt shot his foreman a look that silenced him, then turned back to Eleanor. Tomorrow, we'll ride to the county seat. Register the deed in your name. After that, you're free to do as you please, stay, sell the property, use the money to go wherever you want. The sheer magnitude of his offer left Eleanor speechless. After weeks of having her agency stripped away, piece by piece, the sudden gift of choice was almost too much to comprehend. And what will you do? She finally asked. A muscle worked in his jaw. I've got skill. Can find work. You'd be welcome to stay on, Jake added quickly. We could use the help, especially with winter coming. Eleanor glanced between the two men, suddenly understanding. You're proposing to work for me? On the ranch you built? If you'll have us, Jake confirmed. Sarah and I, we've put down roots here, and Caleb has nowhere else to go, Eleanor finished softly. The reality of Wyatt's sacrifice settled over her like a weight. He hadn't just purchased her freedom. He had surrendered his own security, his own home, on principle alone. Sarah returned from the kitchen, setting a steaming bowl of stew before Eleanor. Eat first, she said firmly. Decisions can wait until morning. You're dead on your feet, child. The rich aroma of the stew reminded Eleanor how long it had been since she'd eaten a proper meal. She took a spoonful, the flavors exploding on her tongue. Venison, root vegetables, herbs she couldn't name. Her stomach clenched painfully, and she forced herself to eat slowly. There's a bedroom ready for you, Sarah continued. Clean clothes, too. Might be a bit large, but they'll do until we can alter them properly. Whose room? Eleanor asked between careful bites. Mine, Wyatt answered simply. I'll take the barn. The thought of displacing him further made Eleanor uncomfortable, but she was too exhausted to argue. The stew warmed her from within, and the fire's heat seeped into her aching muscles. For the first time in weeks, she felt something close to safe. After she finished eating, Sarah showed her to the bedroom, a Spartan space with a narrow bed covered by a patchwork quilt, a chest of drawers, and a small window that looked out toward the mountains. A steaming basin of water waited on the washstand, along with a bar of soap that smelled faintly of pine. Take your time, Sarah said kindly. "No one will disturb you." Left alone, Eleanor shed her filthy dress with shaking fingers. The water was gloriously warm as she washed away the grime of captivity. Sarah had left a nightgown and a heavy flannel robe on the bed. Both were too large, but they were clean and soft against her skin. When she finally lay down, the bed felt impossibly luxurious after weeks of sleeping on hard ground or rough pallets. She expected sleep to claim her immediately, but her mind raced, replaying the extraordinary events of the day. A man had given up everything he owned to free her, not for possession, not for advantage, but because he couldn't stand by and watch an injustice. It defied everything she thought she knew about the harsh world beyond civilization's boundaries. She must have slept eventually, because the next thing she knew, pale dawn light was filtering through the window. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. Then memory flooded back. The auction, the ranch, Wyatt's impossible offer. Eleanor rose and dressed in the clothes Sarah had provided, a simple calico dress that hung loose on her frame and woolen stockings. She braided her hair as best she could without a mirror, then stepped hesitantly into the main room. Sarah was already at the stove, the smell of coffee and frying bacon filling the cabin. "Good morning, dear," she said warmly. "Sleep well." "Better than I have in weeks," Eleanor admitted, moving to the fire to ward off the morning chill. "Are the men already outside?" Sarah nodded. "Chores don't wait, even on days like this. They'll be in shortly for breakfast." She paused in her cooking to study Eleanor more carefully. "You're looking better already. A night's rest does wonders." Eleanor touched her cheek self-consciously. I must still look a fright." "You look like someone who's survived," Sarah corrected gently. "That's something to be proud of." Before Eleanor could respond, the door opened and Jake entered, stamping his boots on the threshold. "Cold morning," he announced, heading straight for the coffee pot. "And Caleb's just finishing with the horses." As if summoned by his name, Wyatt appeared in the doorway, bringing with him the crisp scent of morning air. He nodded to Eleanor, his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Shaw." "Mr. Wyatt," she squared her shoulders, determined to face the day and its decisions with clarity. "I'd like to discuss our arrangement further, if you're willing." After breakfast, Sarah interrupted, setting plates on the table. "Everyone sits, everyone eats. That's the rule in this house." The meal passed in relative silence, broken only by requests to pass dishes and Jake's occasional comments about the day's work ahead. Eleanor found herself studying Wyatt when he wasn't looking, the careful precision of his movements, the quiet authority he carried without seeming to notice it. When the plates were cleared, Jake and Sarah exchanged a glance before Jake spoke. "Sarah and I have chores that need tending. We'll leave you two to talk." Once they had gone, Wyatt refilled their coffee cups and sat across from Eleanor, waiting. "I've been thinking about your offer," she began, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "It's incredibly generous, more than generous. It's necessary," he supplied when she faltered. "Perhaps to you," she acknowledged, "but I can't accept it, not as it stands." A flicker of surprise crossed his face. "You'd rather return to town?" "God, no." The vehemence in her voice surprised even her. "But I won't take everything you've built and leave you with nothing. It isn't right." "What do you propose instead?" Eleanor took a deep breath. "A partnership. The deed remains in your name, but with legal provisions guaranteeing my protection and freedom. I'll work alongside you, not as property, not as charity, but as an equal contributor to this ranch." Wyatt's brow furrowed. "The town won't recognize such an arrangement. Without the deed, you're vulnerable. Then we create a contract, something binding." She leaned forward, warming to her idea. "I was trained as a teacher, Mr. Wyatt. I can read and write and calculate with precision. I can keep your books, manage correspondence, perhaps even teach the children in the area. There aren't many. Even a few would benefit from education." She hesitated, then added, "And I can learn other skills. I'm not afraid of hard work." Wyatt studied her for a long moment, his grey eyes thoughtful. "You're proposing to stay here permanently?" "For now," she clarified, "until I've earned enough to make my own way, should I choose to. All I ask is safety, respect, and the chance to repay what you've done." "You owe me nothing, Miss Shaw." "Eleanor," she corrected him. "If we're to be partners of a sort, you should use my given name." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Eleanor, then. And may I call you Caleb?" He nodded once, the gesture somehow formal despite its simplicity. "Then we have an agreement," she pressed. "Not yet." He rose and moved to a small desk in the corner, returning with paper and a pencil. "If we're doing this properly, we'll need terms, clear boundaries, expectations on both sides." Eleanor felt a surge of respect for his thoroughness. Yes, of course. As they began to outline their unusual agreement, Eleanor couldn't help but marvel at the strange turn her life had taken. 24 hours ago, she had been merchandise, her future determined by the highest bidder. Now she sat across from that bidder, negotiating as an equal. For the first time since the stagecoach attack, she allowed herself to feel something like hope, cautious and fragile, but present nonetheless. The agreement took shape slowly, each word carefully considered. Eleanor insisted on clear terms. She would manage the household and ranch accounts, establish a small school for children in the surrounding homesteads, and learn the basics of ranch work. In exchange, Caleb would provide room, board, and a modest monthly stipend that would be hers alone. Money she could save toward whatever future she might eventually choose. And protection, Caleb added, his pencil pausing on the paper. "That needs to be explicitly stated." Eleanor bristled slightly. "I'm not asking to be coddled." "This isn't about coddling," he replied evenly. "The men who brought you to that auction block are still out there. So are the ones who bid on you. The cattle baron, Harlan Reed, doesn't take kindly to being outbid." The memory of Reed's piggy eyes and meaty fists made Eleanor shudder involuntarily. "Very well. Protection is included." They continued working through the morning, refining the document that would define their unusual arrangement. Eleanor was impressed by Caleb's attention to detail and his insistence on fairness. He was clearly a man accustomed to keeping his word. "There's one more thing," she said as they neared completion. "I want a clause that allows either of us to dissolve this agreement with 30 days. Notice." Caleb's pen stilled. "You expect trouble." "I expect nothing," she replied carefully. "But I won't enter into another situation where I'm trapped. And you shouldn't be bound to this arrangement indefinitely either." He considered this, then nodded. "Fair enough." He added the provision to their contract, then signed his name at the bottom in a surprisingly elegant hand. "Your turn." Eleanor took the pen, her fingers brushing his briefly. She signed her name beneath his, feeling oddly as though she were signing a marriage contract rather than a business arrangement. "There," she said, setting the pen down. "Partners, partners," he echoed, his expression unreadable. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. Jake entered, stamping snow from his boots. "Storm's coming in faster than we thought," he announced. "Need to move the eastern herd to the sheltered pasture." Caleb rose immediately. "I'll saddle the horses." "I'll help," Eleanor said, standing as well. Both men turned to look at her with identical expressions of surprise. "No offense, Miss Eleanor," Jake said carefully, "but cattle driving isn't ladies' work." "Perhaps not in ordinary circumstances," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "But we've just established that these circumstances are far from ordinary. I need to learn, and you need every hand available." Caleb studied her for a moment, then gave a short nod. "She's right, Jake. We're short-handed as it is." To Eleanor, he added, "Do you ride?" "I had lessons in Boston." The corner of his mouth twitched. "Ranch riding is different from ladies' lessons." "Then I'll learn quickly," she said with more confidence than she felt. "As long as the horse is patient." "Dapple," Caleb decided after a moment's thought. "She's steady, not too tall." Within the hour, Eleanor found herself astride a grey mare with a gentle gait, following Caleb and Jake toward the eastern pasture. The sky had darkened ominously, and the wind carried the sharp scent of impending snow. She had changed into clothes more suitable for riding, trousers and a heavy shirt that Sarah had altered hastily from Jake's spare clothing, topped with one of Caleb's old coats. "Ma, stay close," Caleb instructed as they approached the herd. "Don't get between the cattle and where they want to go. If anything happens, head for high ground." Eleanor nodded, gripping the reins tightly. The cattle, about 30 head by her count, were already restless, sensing the coming storm. Jake rode to the far side of the herd, while Caleb positioned himself at the rear. "We'll push them west, toward the valley," he called to her. Just keep them moving in the right direction." What followed was a crash course in cattle driving that no Boston finishing school could have prepared her for. The wind rose, slicing through her borrowed coat, and the first fat snowflakes began to fall as they urged the reluctant herd toward shelter. Eleanor's thighs burned from gripping the saddle, and her hands grew numb despite her gloves. But she refused to complain. She watched Caleb from the corner of her eye, marveling at how he seemed to anticipate the cattle's movements, redirecting strays with subtle shifts of his horse. There was a fluid grace to him that belied his usual stoic demeanor. The storm intensified as they drove the last of the cattle into the sheltered valley. Snow fell in heavy curtains now, and the wind howled across the open range. By the time they turned toward home, visibility had dropped dramatically. "Stay between us," Jake shouted over the wind. "Easy to get turned around in a whiteout." They rode in tight formation, the horses picking their way carefully through the deepening snow. Eleanor's entire body ached, and she could no longer feel her toes. But a strange exhilaration filled her. She had done it, faced the elements, done her part, proven herself useful. The barn appeared through the swirling white like a mirage, its solid shape a welcome sight. They dismounted in the sheltered interior, and Eleanor nearly collapsed as her frozen legs hit the ground. Caleb caught her elbow, steadying her without comment. "I'll see to the horses," Jake said, already unbuckling his saddle. "You two get inside before you freeze." Eleanor wanted to protest, to insist on helping, but her body betrayed her. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably, and her fingers fumbled uselessly with the straps of her saddle. "Let me," Caleb said quietly, moving her gently aside to tend to Dapple. "Go on to the house. Sarah will have something hot waiting." Too cold to argue, Eleanor stumbled through the snow toward the cabin, the wind nearly knocking her off her feet. When she finally pushed through the door, the warmth hit her like a physical force. Sarah took one look at her and rushed forward. "Merciful heavens, child, you're half frozen." She helped Eleanor out of her snow-crusted coat and pushed her toward the fire. "Strip those wet things off. I've laid out dry clothes in the bedroom." Eleanor complied gratefully, changing into the warm flannel dress Sarah had prepared. By the time she returned to the main room, sensation was painfully returning to her extremities. She sank into a chair by the fire, extending her hands toward the flames. "Here." Sarah pressed a mug of hot cider into her hands. "Drink this. It'll warm you from the inside." The door banged open again, and Caleb entered in a swirl of snow. Unlike Eleanor, he seemed unfazed by the cold, methodically removing his outer layers before joining her by the fire. "Jake?" Sarah asked, handing him a mug of his own, finishing with the horses. "He'll be along." Caleb took a long drink, then glanced at Eleanor. "How are you holding up?" "I'll live," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite her still chattering teeth. "Though I may never feel my toes again." A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "They'll thaw. Might wish they hadn't when they do." Was I any help at all, or just in the way? He considered her question seriously. "You stayed mounted, didn't panic. I kept the herd moving." That's more than many can say their first time out. Coming from him, it felt like high praise. Eleanor tried to hide her pleased smile behind her mug. Sarah bustled about, preparing a hearty stew for dinner. "Storm like this could last days," she remarked. "Good thing we're well provisioned." "The cattle?" Eleanor asked. "They'll be fine in the valley," Caleb assured her. "Plenty of fodder stored in the lean-to, and the ridge blocks the worst of the wind." Jake arrived soon after, bringing a fresh blast of cold air with him. "It's turning into a real blizzard," he announced, shedding his coat. "Haven't seen one hit this early in years." Dinner was a quiet affair, all of them too tired for much conversation. Eleanor found herself nodding off over her bowl, the day's exertions catching up with her. She excused herself early, retreating to what she was already thinking of as her room. As she slipped beneath the heavy quilt, she realized that for the first time in weeks, she wasn't planning an escape. The thought should have alarmed her, had she so quickly accepted this strange new life. But instead, it brought an unexpected peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new learning. But for tonight, she was safe, warm, and surprisingly content. Sleep claimed her quickly, and she dreamed of riding across open plains, the wind in her hair, a tall figure always at her side, watching, guiding, protecting without confining. When she woke the next morning, the storm had intensified. Snow piled against the windows, and the wind screamed around the eaves like a living thing. The cabin, with its thick walls and well-stocked firewood, felt like an island of safety in a sea of white. Caleb and Jake had already gone out to check the animals, according to Sarah. Eleanor helped with breakfast preparations, finding comfort in the domestic routine. She was setting the table when the men returned, bringing a blast of frigid air and the scent of fresh snow with them. "Everything secure?" Sarah asked, pouring coffee. "For now," Jake replied, rubbing his hands together to warm them. "Although we'll need to dig paths to the barn if this keeps up." The blizzard lasted 3 days, transforming the world outside into an endless expanse of white. Inside the cabin, a new routine emerged. Eleanor helped Sarah with cooking and mending, while learning the intricacies of managing a ranch household. In the evenings, she began taking inventory of supplies and reviewing the ledgers Caleb had kept in a precise but basic manner. "Your bookkeeping is remarkably thorough," she commented on the third night, looking up from the leather-bound volume spread before her on the table. Outside, the storm had finally begun to abate, the wind's howl softening to an occasional moan. Caleb, who was cleaning his rifle by the fire, shrugged slightly. "Numbers matter out here. One miscalculation can mean the difference between surviving winter and starving. I could organize these better," she offered. "Create separate columns for different expenses. Track patterns over time." He considered this, then nodded. "If you think it would help, it would give me something useful to do. At least until I can start teaching." Caleb set aside his rifle and moved to join her at the table. "About that, there are maybe 8 children within riding distance, mostly from homesteads and small ranches, ages from about 5 to 14. You've already counted them?" Eleanor asked, surprised. "Thought about it after you mentioned teaching." He looked slightly uncomfortable at her scrutiny. Seemed worth knowing. The realization that he had taken her teaching aspirations seriously enough to consider the logistics warmed her. "Thank you. 8 students would be a wonderful start. The problem is space," he continued. "The nearest proper town is 20 miles away, too far for daily travel, especially in winter. Could we use a room here?" She gestured around the cabin. "Might be cramped." He hesitated, then added, "There's the old bunkhouse. It's not much. Was built for ranch hands before I scaled down to just Jake. Needs work, but it has a good stove and sturdy walls." Eleanor felt a flicker of excitement. "Could I see it once the snow clears?" "Course." His eyes met hers briefly, and she thought she detected approval in his gaze. The next morning dawned clear and blindingly bright, the sun reflecting off snow-covered landscape that had been transformed by the storm. After breakfast, Caleb and Jake began the arduous task of digging paths to the barn and outbuildings. "I want to help," Eleanor insisted, bundling into her borrowed coat. Sarah looked doubtful. "It's bitter cold out there, and that's heavy work." "I'll do what I can," Eleanor replied firmly. "I won't sit by the fire while everyone else works." Outside, the cold stole her breath immediately. The snow reached nearly to her knees in places, and the effort of wading through it was exhausting. Still, she grabbed a shovel and began clearing alongside the men, focusing on the lighter snow while they tackled the deeper drifts. Caleb watched her for a moment, then wordlessly adjusted his own work area to shield her somewhat from the biting wind. They worked in companionable silence, the only sounds the scrape of shovels and their labored breathing, forming white clouds in the frigid air. By midday, they had cleared essential pathways. Eleanor's arms and back ached fiercely, and her fingers and toes burned with cold despite her layers. But satisfaction outweighed discomfort. She had contributed. "The bunkhouse," she reminded Caleb as they put away their shovels. "Could we look at it now?" He nodded, leading her through the snow to a small, sturdy structure about 50 yards from the main cabin. Inside, it was cold and dusty, with 4 simple bunks built against the walls, a pot-bellied stove in the center, and a rough-hewn table with benches. A layer of dust covered everything, and cobwebs festooned the corners, but Eleanor immediately saw its potential. "Oh, this would be perfect," she said, turning in a slow circle. "We could remove the bunks, build simple desks and benches, perhaps add a blackboard on that wall." Caleb leaned against the doorframe, watching her. It needs a lot of work, yes, but it's possible. She crossed to the window, wiping frost from the glass to peer outside. Good light, too. We could start as soon as the weather allows. You're that eager to teach? Eleanor turned to face him. It's what I trained for, what I came west to do before. She trailed off, the memory of the stagecoach attack still too raw to articulate fully. Caleb straightened, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. Then we'll make it happen. Jake's handy with carpentry. I can hunt up a blackboard in town. Thank you, she said simply. The words seemed inadequate for the opportunity he was giving her, a chance to reclaim not just her safety, but her purpose. As they walked back to the main cabin, Eleanor studied Caleb covertly. In just a few days, her perception of him had shifted dramatically. The quiet, intimidating man who had purchased her at auction had revealed himself to be thoughtful, fair, and surprisingly supportive of her independence. It was confusing. "Is something on your mind?" he asked, catching her glance. Eleanor hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I'm trying to reconcile who I thought you were with who you seem to be." His stride faltered slightly. "And who did you think I was?" "At first, another captor, perhaps kinder than the last, but still someone who saw me as property." Caleb's jaw tightened. "And now I'm not sure what to think," she admitted. "You're unlike any man I've encountered." He was silent for several steps. Then quietly, "That's not necessarily a compliment." It wasn't meant as either compliment or criticism. Merely an observation. They had reached the cabin door, but Caleb paused before opening it. "People are rarely what they first appear to be, Eleanor, for better or worse." The cryptic statement hung between them as they entered the warmth of the cabin, where Sarah was preparing a hearty midday meal. The days following the storm fell into a rhythm. Mornings were devoted to ranch work, feeding animals, repairing storm damage, checking on the cattle. Eleanor insisted on participating despite her initial clumsiness, determined to earn her keep. Afternoons she spent organizing the ranch accounts and increasingly planning her school. Caleb proved true to his word about supporting her teaching ambitions. He and Jake began clearing out the bunkhouse, removing the old bunks and repairing a leaky corner of the roof. When the weather allowed, he rode to neighboring homesteads to speak with parents about sending their children for lessons. 2 weeks after the storm, a wagon arrived bearing supplies from town, including a proper blackboard, chalk, primers, and slates that Caleb had ordered without telling her. "How did you manage this?" Eleanor asked, running her fingers reverently over the teaching materials laid out on the table. "Had credit at the mercantile," he replied with a shrug. "Owner owed me a favor. These must have cost." "Worth it," he interrupted. "Education matters out here, maybe more than back east. These children have fewer opportunities." Eleanor studied him. This paradox of a man who spoke little, but whose actions revealed depths she was only beginning to understand. "You're a surprising person, Caleb Wyatt." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Not really, just practical." That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Eleanor found herself watching Caleb as he whittled a piece of wood with precise, careful movements. His hands fascinated her, strong and calloused from labor, yet capable of remarkable gentleness when treating an injured animal or handling delicate objects. "May I ask you something personal?" she ventured. He glanced up, knife pausing. "You can ask. How did you come to be here, alone on this ranch? You mentioned once having workers, but now it's just you and the Pullmans." Caleb was silent for so long that Eleanor thought he might not answer. Finally, he set down his whittling and stared into the fire. "Came west after the war," he said quietly. "Army taught me to ride, shoot, survive. Didn't want to go back east afterward, too many ghosts." His voice was matter-of-fact, but Eleanor sensed the weight behind each carefully chosen word. "Worked cattle drives for a few years, saved enough to stake a claim on this land, built it up slow. And the Pullmans?" Jake was on those same drives. Good man in a tight spot. When his lungs started troubling him, too much trail dust, I offered him and Sarah a place here. More settled work, but the other hands, a shadow crossed his face, had 4 at the peak, couldn't keep them after last year's drought, had to sell half the herd, scale back. He picked up his whittling again, signaling an end to the conversation. Eleanor accepted the boundary, content with the small glimpse he had offered into his past. Each such revelation helped her understand him better, the man who had sacrificed everything to save a stranger. That night, As she lay in bed listening to the wind whisper around the eaves, Eleanor faced an uncomfortable truth. She was beginning to care for Caleb Wyatt, not just as her rescuer or protector, but as a man, complex, honorable, and increasingly important to her sense of safety and belonging. The realization was as frightening as it was exhilarating. She had come west seeking independence, a chance to build a life on her own terms. Instead, she had nearly lost everything, only to be rescued by a man to whom she now felt bound by gratitude, admiration, and something deeper she wasn't ready to name. Could she truly build a future here, on this remote ranch, with this quiet, enigmatic man at its center? Or was she simply substituting one form of dependency for another? Sleep eluded her as she wrestled with these questions, watching moonlight trace patterns on the ceiling and wondering what tomorrow would bring. Spring arrived gradually. Then, all at once, the snow receded, revealing tender green shoots beneath. Creeks swelled with meltwater, and the valley echoed with the calls of returning birds. With the warmer weather came the culmination of Eleanor's school preparations. The bunkhouse transformation was complete, bunks replaced with simple desks and benches, the blackboard mounted securely on the wall, windows cleaned and repaired to let in ample light. Caleb had even constructed a small platform at the front where Eleanor could stand to teach. Word had spread about the new school at Shadow Rock Ranch. On the appointed first day, not 8 but 11 children arrived, some riding double on ponies, others brought by parents in wagons. They ranged from shy 5-year-olds to gangly teenagers, all dressed in their cleanest clothes, eyes wide with curiosity about their new teacher. Eleanor greeted them at the door of the schoolhouse, heart pounding with nervous excitement. She wore her best dress, the one Sarah had altered from fabric ordered from the mercantile, and had pinned her hair in a neat, professional style. "Welcome to Shadow Rock School," she said warmly, ushering them inside. "I'm Miss Shaw, and I'm very pleased to meet each of you." From the corner of her eye, she spotted Caleb watching from a distance, leaning against the corral fence. When he saw her notice him, he touched the brim of his hat in a small gesture of encouragement, then turned back to his work with the horses. That first day was exhausting but exhilarating. Eleanor assessed her students, widely varying levels of education, established basic rules, and began grouping them according to ability. By afternoon, when the last child had been collected by their parents, her voice was hoarse and her feet ached, but her spirits soared. "How did it go?" Caleb asked at dinner that evening. "Wonderfully," she replied, unable to contain her smile. "They're eager to learn, even the older boys who pretended indifference at first. Thomas Miller has a particular aptitude for mathematics, and little Emma Hayes already reads quite well for her age." Caleb listened attentively as she described each student, occasionally asking questions that revealed his genuine interest in their progress. It struck Eleanor how naturally they had fallen into this routine, sharing meals, discussing the day's events, planning for tomorrow. "Thank you," she said suddenly, interrupting her own account of the school day, his brow furrowed slightly. "For what?" "For making this possible. The school, my teaching, all of it." Caleb shook his head. "You did the work. I just provided space." "You provided much more than that," Eleanor insisted. "You gave me back my purpose when it had been taken from me." He looked down at his plate, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Everyone deserves purpose," he said simply. Later that evening, as they sat by the fire, Eleanor grading the first simple assignments, Caleb repairing a bridle, she found herself sneaking glances at him, studying the way the firelight played across his features. In the 3 months since the auction, she had come to know this man better than she had expected was possible, yet he remained in many ways a mystery. He rarely spoke of his past, though occasional references suggested a difficult childhood back east, service in the war, and years of hard living before settling at Shadow Rock. He never complained, never raised his voice, and treated everyone, from the children who now attended her school to the drifters who occasionally stopped by seeking work, with the same quiet respect. And he never, not once, made her feel that she owed him anything for saving her from that auction block. As spring deepened into early summer, the ranch grew busier. calves were born, requiring constant attention. Fields needed planting, fences demanded repair after winter damage, and 100 other tasks filled their days. Eleanor balanced her teaching with increasing contributions to the ranch work, finding satisfaction in learning new skills. Her students thrived under her guidance. Word of the school's success spread, bringing 3 more children from more distant homesteads who stayed with neighboring families during the week to attend classes. Parents began stopping by with gifts: fresh bread, preserves, handmade items, small tokens of appreciation that touched Eleanor deeply. "You've made quite an impression," Caleb commented one evening as she arranged a newly gifted quilt on her bed. Eleanor smoothed the colorful patches with gentle fingers. "They're grateful for any education their children can receive. It's not me specifically, it is you," he countered quietly. "I hear how they talk. The Miller boy who couldn't read 3 months ago is now devouring any book he can find. The Hayes girl is teaching her mother her letters. You did that." His praise warmed her more than it should have. "We did it together," she corrected. "But none of this would exist without you." Their eyes met across the small room, and something shifted in the air between them, something Eleanor had felt building for weeks, but had been careful not to acknowledge. Caleb seemed to feel it too, for he took a small step back, breaking the moment. "Town tomorrow," he said abruptly. "Need supplies. Thought you might want to come along, get things for the school." "I'd like that," she replied, pretending not to notice the sudden tension. The journey to town the next day was pleasant, the June weather mild, and the landscape vibrant with wildflowers. Eleanor had been to the small trading post twice before, but never to the larger town where they were headed today. As they drove, Caleb pointed out landmarks and shared bits of local history, more talkative than usual. "Town's grown since I first came through," he said as buildings appeared on the horizon. Gold strike in the hills brought prospectors. Ranches and farms followed. Now there's even a proper church and hotel. Eleanor smoothed her skirts nervously. "Will people know about me, about how we met?" Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. "Some might, doesn't matter. It matters if it causes trouble for you. Anyone who'd judge you for surviving, or me for stopping an injustice, isn't worth worrying about," he replied firmly. His certainty comforted her as they entered the town, a single main street lined with businesses, muddy side streets branching off toward modest homes. People glanced at their wagon with casual interest as they passed. They stopped first at the mercantile, where Eleanor selected school supplies while Caleb arranged for larger items to be delivered to the run. The proprietor's wife, a cheerful woman named Mrs. Finch, was delighted to learn of the school at Shadow Rock and insisted on showing Eleanor their newest shipment of books. "It's so wonderful what you're doing for those children," Mrs. Finch said warmly. "And for Mr. Wyatt too. That man's been alone too long. Needs a good woman's influence." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. "Our arrangement is professional, Mrs. Finch. I teach the local children, and Mr. Wyatt provides the facilities." Mrs. Finch smiled knowingly. "Of course, dear. Professional." She patted Eleanor's hand. "Still, I haven't seen Caleb Wyatt look at anyone the way he looks at you when you're not watching." Before Eleanor could formulate a response, Caleb appeared, carrying their purchases. "Ready?" he asked, seemingly oblivious to her flustered state. They were loading the wagon when a familiar voice called out, sending a chill down Eleanor's spine. Well, well, Wyatt and his purchased bride. Harlan Reed stood in the street, flanked by 2 men Eleanor recognized from the auction. The cattle baron's expensive clothes couldn't disguise his brutish nature, and the sneer on his face made his intentions clear. Caleb moved subtly, positioning himself between Eleanor and Reed. "We're just getting supplies, Reed. No trouble." "No trouble?" Reed laughed harshly. "As you made me look like a fool that day, outbidding me with land you had no right to trade. A man doesn't forget something like that. That's your problem, not mine." Caleb's voice remained even, but Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders. Reed's gaze shifted to Eleanor, his eyes moving over her in a way that made her skin crawl. Worth it, was she? Must be quite something to give up everything for. Eleanor stepped forward before Caleb could respond. "Mr. Reed, I believe you were addressing my business partner, not me. If you have something to say about me, you can say it to my face." A ripple of surprise passed through the small crowd that had gathered to watch. Reed's face darkened with anger, then twisted into an ugly smile. "Got yourself a spirited one, Wyatt. I'd have broken that soon enough." "That's enough, Reed," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "Get on with your business and let us get on with ours." For a tense moment, Eleanor thought Reed might escalate the confrontation. Then he spat in the dirt and turned away. "This isn't finished, Wyatt. Not by a long shot." The ride back to the ranch was subdued, the pleasant mood of the morning shattered by Reed's threat. Eleanor watched Caleb's profile, noting the tight set of his jaw and the distant look in his eyes. "He won't let it go, will he?" she asked finally. Caleb glanced at her briefly. "Men like Reed don't forgive what they see as insults to their pride." "I'm sorry to have brought this trouble to your door." "You didn't bring anything," he replied firmly. "This is on Reed, not you. Never you." The vehemence in his voice surprised her. "Des, what will we do?" "Be vigilant. Reed's bark is often worse than his bite. He likes intimidation more than actual confrontation." But as they turned onto the road to Shadow Rock, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful existence was about to be disrupted. The sanctuary they had built together suddenly seemed fragile, threatened by forces beyond their control. The encounter with Reed cast a shadow over Shadow Rock, though life continued its steady rhythm. Eleanor taught her growing class of students, Caleb and Jake tended the ranch, and Sarah kept the household running with quiet efficiency. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. Caleb began carrying his rifle more frequently, even on routine tasks around the property. Jake rode the boundaries daily, checking for signs of trespassers. And Eleanor found herself startling at unexpected sounds, memories of her captivity rushing back with unwelcome vividness. "You don't think he'd really come here, do you?" she asked Caleb one evening as they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold. Caleb was silent for a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon. Reed's not stupid. Direct confrontation would bring the law down on him eventually. But he's patient and vindictive. What does he want? Revenge, partly. Caleb shifted in his chair, the wood creaking beneath him. But it's more than that. Reed believes he owns this valley. Anyone who defies him threatens that belief. "And you defied him spectacularly," Eleanor murmured. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Suppose I did." The simple admission sent an unexpected warmth through her. In the months since the auction, she had come to admire many things about Caleb Wyatt. His quiet strength, his unwavering fairness, his support for her independence. But it was his willingness to stand against injustice, regardless of the cost, that moved her most deeply. "No regrets?" she asked softly. His eyes met hers, steady and certain. "Not one." Something shifted between them in that moment, a barrier crumbling, a truth acknowledged without words. Eleanor felt her breath catch, aware suddenly of how close they sat, how the fading light softened his features, how his hand rested just inches from hers on the porch railing. The spell broke when Jake rounded the corner of the house, his expression grave. "Caleb, you're needed at the north pasture. 2 steers are down." Caleb rose immediately. "Sickness. Looks like poison. Might be that yellow weed we found last week." "I'll come with you," Eleanor said, standing as well. Both men looked at her with identical expressions of concern. "It's nearly dark," Jake protested. "All the more reason you need an extra pair of hands," she countered. "Sarah can watch the house." Caleb studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Saddle up. Bring a lantern." They rode hard to the north pasture, where they found 2 young steers thrashing on the ground, foam flecking their muzzles. Eleanor held the lantern high as Caleb examined them, his hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the fading light. "Larkspur poisoning," he confirmed grimly. "Must have been that new patch by the creek." "Can they be saved?" Eleanor asked, kneeling beside him in the grass, heedless of her skirts. Maybe. Need to get the poison moving through them faster." He glanced at her. "It won't be pretty. Tell me what to do." For the next 2 hours, they worked side by side in the darkness, forcing a foul-smelling herbal mixture down the steers' throats, keeping the animals from injuring themselves as they convulsed, watching anxiously for signs of improvement. Jake rode back to the ranch for more supplies, leaving them alone with the suffering animals. Eleanor's arms ached from restraining the larger steer, and her dress was filthy with mud and worse, but she refused to yield her position. Caleb worked with focused intensity, his movements sure despite the difficult conditions. "There," he said finally, as the first steer's breathing eased. "I think he's turning the corner." Eleanor sagged with relief, reaching out instinctively to touch Caleb's arm. "You saved him." "We saved him," he corrected, covering her hand with his own. His palm was warm against her chilled fingers, the contact sending a jolt of awareness through her. For a heartbeat, they remained frozen, connected by that simple touch, their faces close in the lantern light. Then the second steer lowed weakly, breaking the moment. By the time they returned to the ranch, dawn was breaking on the horizon. They were exhausted, filthy, but triumphant. Both animals would recover. Sarah took one look at them and ordered hot baths prepared, clucking disapprovingly at their bedraggled state. "You'll catch your death," she scolded Eleanor, helping her peel off her ruined dress. "Was it really necessary for you to be out all night in a cow pasture?" "It was," Eleanor replied simply. Sarah's expression softened. "You're becoming quite the rancher, aren't you? A far cry from the city teacher who arrived here." Eleanor sank into the steaming bath with a grateful sigh. "I'm still that teacher. I'm just more now, more indeed." The woman who had been sold at auction would hardly recognize herself today, confident on horseback, capable of handling sick cattle, unafraid of hard work or long nights. She had built something here, not just a school, but a life with purpose and meaning. And she had built it with Caleb, whose steady presence had become as essential to her as breathing. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it filled her with a curious peace. Whatever was growing between them, it was rooted in mutual respect and shared purpose. Nothing like the possessive interest Reed and the others had shown at the auction. The following week brought an unexpected visitor to Shadow Rock. Eleanor was dismissing her students for the day when a sleek black carriage pulled by matched greys rolled into the yard. A distinguished gentleman in an Eastern-cut suit stepped down, surveying the ranch with keen interest. "Lord Miss Shaw," he called, approaching the schoolhouse. "Eleanor Shaw." Eleanor instinctively gathered the remaining children behind her, wary of strangers after all that had happened. "Yes, who's asking?" "James Harrington, ma'am, attorney from Boston." He removed his hat politely. "I've been looking for you for quite some time." "Boston?" Eleanor's heart raced. "Why would a Boston attorney be looking for me?" "Perhaps we could speak privately." He glanced at the curious children. "It's a matter of some importance." Caleb appeared from the direction of the barn, alerted by the unusual carriage. His stance was cautious as he approached, one hand resting near the pistol at his hip. "Everything all right, Eleanor? Mr. Harrington claims to be an attorney from Boston," she explained. "He says he's been looking for me." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "What business do you have with Miss Shaw?" Harrington cleared his throat. "As I was about to explain, I represent the estate of Margaret Thornton, Miss Shaw's maternal aunt. She passed away 6 months ago, leaving a substantial inheritance to her niece." Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. "Aunt Margaret? I barely knew her. She and my mother were estranged for years. Nevertheless, you are her sole heir. The sum is considerable. Property in Boston and a financial portfolio worth approximately $30,000. The figure hung in the air like smoke, almost incomprehensible in its magnitude. $30,000 was a fortune, enough to buy a dozen ranches like Shadow Rock, enough to secure independence for several lifetimes. "I've been tracking you since you left Boston," Harrington continued. "When you didn't arrive in Santa Fe as scheduled, I feared the worst. It was only by chance that I heard rumors in town of a Boston-educated woman living at this ranch." Eleanor felt Caleb stiffen beside her, though his expression remained unreadable. "There are papers to sign, accounts to transfer," Harrington went on. "I've taken a room at the hotel in town. Perhaps you could come tomorrow to review the documents." "Yes," Eleanor said automatically, still reeling from the news. "Yes, of course." After Harrington departed, promising to send a carriage for her the next day, an uncomfortable silence fell between Eleanor and Caleb. They stood in the yard, watching the dust settle in the carriage's wake. $30,000, Caleb said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "And that's quite a change in circumstances." Eleanor turned to him, searching his face for some indication of his thoughts. "It seems unreal. You could go anywhere, do anything." His eyes remained fixed on the horizon. Return to Boston, open a proper school in a city. The implication hung unspoken between them. She could leave Shadow Rock, leave him. "Caleb, we should tell Sarah and Jake," he interrupted, already turning toward the house. "And they'll want to hear your good news." Eleanor watched him walk away, frustration and confusion warring within her. This windfall, should have been cause for celebration. Instead, it felt like a wedge driving between them, forcing questions she wasn't ready to answer. That evening, dinner was a subdued affair despite Sarah's attempts to celebrate Eleanor's unexpected fortune. Caleb was quieter than usual, responding to questions with monosyllables, avoiding Eleanor's gaze across the table. Later, unable to sleep, Eleanor slipped outside to the porch. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. She heard footsteps behind her and knew without turning that it was Caleb. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, coming to stand beside her at the railing. "Too much to think about," she admitted. "I imagine so." Silence stretched between them, taut with unspoken words. "You think I'll leave?" she said finally, facing him directly. "That's why you've withdrawn." Caleb's expression remained carefully neutral, but Eleanor could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the porch railing too tightly. "It would be the sensible choice," he said finally. "And $30,000 buys a lot more than this ranch can offer. Is that what you think I want? To be sensible, to buy things?" He turned to her then, his eyes searching her face in the moonlight. "I think you deserve every opportunity this inheritance provides. A real life, not one forced on you by circumstance. And this isn't real." Eleanor gestured to the ranch around them, frustration rising in her voice. "At the school I've built, the students who depend on me, the work we've done together, that's not real." "It's real," he conceded quietly, "but it's not what you chose, not freely." The truth of his words stung. She hadn't chosen Shadowrock. She had been brought here through violence and desperation, saved by this man's extraordinary act. No matter how much she had come to care for this place and its people, that original coercion hung over everything like a shadow. "I'm going to town tomorrow," she said carefully. "I'll meet with Mr. Harrington, review the documents, and make my decision based on all the facts. That's all I can promise right now." Caleb nodded once, his expression softening slightly. "That's fair. And you?" she pressed. "What do you want, Caleb?" "You've never really said." He looked away, his gaze returning to the distant mountains. For a long moment, she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "I want you to be free, truly free, even if that freedom takes you away from here." The simple honesty of his statement took her breath away. Here was a man who had sacrificed everything to save her from bondage, and now he was prepared to sacrifice his own happiness to ensure her freedom remained absolute. "And if my freedom led me back here?" she asked softly. His eyes found hers again, and in them she saw a flicker of something raw and vulnerable. "Then it would be your choice. That would make all the difference." They stood together in silence after that, side by side on the porch, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. No more words were necessary. Tomorrow would bring decisions, but for tonight, this quiet understanding was enough. The carriage arrived promptly at 9 the next morning. Eleanor had dressed in her best attire, a navy blue dress with a crisp white collar that Sarah had helped her sew for school occasions. Her hair was neatly pinned, and she carried a small leather satchel containing the few personal documents she still possessed. Caleb stood in the yard as she prepared to depart, his expression carefully composed. "Take Jake with you," he insisted. "I don't trust Reed to stay away if he learns you're in town alone." Eleanor nodded, accepting his concern without argument. "I should be back by evening. Take whatever time you need." His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his uncertainty. "This is important." She hesitated, wanting to reassure him but unsure how to bridge the distance that had grown between them. In the end, she simply squeezed his hand briefly before climbing into the carriage. The journey to town gave her time to think, to consider options that had seemed impossible just days ago. $30,000 meant true independence. She could establish her own school anywhere, travel, pursue further education, secure a comfortable future without depending on anyone. Yet as the miles passed, she found her thoughts continually returning to Shadowrock, to the students who were flourishing under her guidance, to Sarah and Jake, who had become like family, and always, inevitably, to Caleb. What did she feel for him? Gratitude, certainly, for her rescue, respect for his principles and integrity, admiration for his quiet strength. But there was something deeper, too, something that made her heart beat faster. faster when their eyes met, something that felt perilously close to love. The town was busier than on her previous visits, wagons and riders crowding the main street. Jake escorted her to the hotel, hovering protectively as they made their way through the bustling lobby to the private dining room where Harrington awaited. "Miss Shaw," the attorney greeted her, rising from his seat at a table covered with documents. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit down." Eleanor composed herself, determined to approach this meeting with clear-headed rationality. "Mr. Harrington, I have many questions about this inheritance." "Of course." He began spreading documents before her. "Your aunt's will is quite specific. The entire estate passes to you with no restrictions or conditions." For the next 2 hours, Eleanor reviewed deeds, bank statements, investment portfolios, and legal certificates, tangible evidence of a fortune she had never expected to possess. Harrington answered her questions patiently, explaining the mechanisms by which she could access and manage her new wealth. "You'll need to return to Boston eventually to sign the final papers," he explained, "but I can arrange for preliminary transfers immediately. Perhaps $5,000 as an initial sum. That would allow you to make arrangements for your journey east." Eleanor stared at the figure he had written on a bank draft. $5,000, more money than most people in the territory would see in a lifetime. Enough to purchase Shadow Rock outright, with plenty left over. "Mr. Harrington," she said slowly, "what if I chose not to return to Boston? Could the estate be managed from here?" The attorney looked surprised. "Well, yes, with the proper legal framework, but surely you don't intend to remain in this frontier. Boston offers every comfort and opportunity a lady of means could desire." "I have opportunities here as well," she replied, thinking of her school, of the children who depended on her. "Different ones, perhaps, but no less meaningful." Harrington studied her with newfound curiosity. "You've changed, Miss Shaw." The young woman who left Boston was eager to establish herself as a proper educator in a civilized setting. "Circumstances change people, Mr. Harrington." Eleanor straightened her shoulders. "Now, tell me what arrangements we can make if I choose to remain in the territory." By the time they concluded their business, the afternoon was waning. Eleanor left the hotel with a bank draft for a substantial sum, legal documents establishing her as the heiress to the Thornton estate, and a clearer understanding of her options. Jake was waiting outside, having spent the time at the livery stable checking on potential routes home that would avoid Reed's property. "All set, Miss Eleanor?" he asked, eyeing the portfolio she carried. "Yes." "Jake, we can head back to Shadow Rock now." As they made their way toward their wagon, a commotion further down the street caught their attention. A crowd had gathered outside the saloon, voices raised in anger. Eleanor froze as she recognized one of those voices. "Caleb." "We need to go there," she said urgently, already moving toward the disturbance. Jake caught her arm. "Miss Eleanor, if there's trouble, Caleb's there," she interrupted. "Ma, we can't leave without him." They pushed through the curious onlookers to find Caleb facing Reed and 3 of his men in the dusty street. Caleb's expression was calm, but Eleanor could see the dangerous tension in his stance. "You had no right to interfere," Reed was saying, his face flushed with anger. "That land was mine to claim. The Petersons have worked that homestead for 5 years. Caleb replied evenly. "Do your cattle destroying their crops doesn't give you claim to their property." Reed's hand hovered near his pistol. "You're becoming a nuisance, Wyatt. First the woman, now this. Seems you need a lesson in respecting your betters." Eleanor stepped forward before Jake could stop her. "Mr. Reed," she called clearly, drawing all eyes to her. "Is there a problem here?" Reed's expression darkened further at the sight of her. "Well, if it isn't the schoolmarm herself, come to watch your protector get what's coming to him." Caleb's eyes met Eleanor's briefly, a silent warning to stay back. She ignored it, moving to stand beside him. "Actually, I've just come from a meeting with my attorney," she said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "It seems I've inherited a substantial estate, $30,000. To be precise." Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Even Reed looked momentarily taken aback. "Since financial matters seem important to you, Mr. Reed, Eleanor continued coolly. Perhaps you should know that I now have the means to purchase your entire operation several times over. Should you persist in threatening people I care about, I might become interested in doing just that. Reed's face contorted with rage and disbelief. You're bluffing. Eleanor opened her portfolio and removed the bank draft, holding it where he could see the figure. I never bluff about business matters, Mr. Reed. Ask anyone in town. The news of my inheritance is hardly a secret now. The balance of power had shifted palpably. Reed glanced around at the watching townspeople, aware that his usual intimidation tactics seemed suddenly less effective against a woman of means. And this isn't over, he growled, backing away. Not by a long shot. On the contrary, Eleanor replied calmly. I believe it is. As Reed and his men retreated, Eleanor turned to find Caleb staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Surprise, admiration, and something deeper that made her heart race. That was either very brave or very foolish, he said quietly. I learned from the best, she replied, matching his tone. What are you doing in town? I thought you were staying at the ranch today. Caleb glanced toward the Peterson homestead at the edge of town. James Peterson sent word that Reed's men were threatening to burn them out. Couldn't ignore that. So you rode straight into trouble, Eleanor said, unable to keep the exasperation from her voice. A corner of his mouth lifted in a half-smile. Says the woman who just confronted Reed with nothing but a bank draft for protection. The crowd around them had begun to disperse, the excitement fading now that violence had been averted. Jake approached, leading their horses. We should head back before dark, he suggested, eyeing the western horizon where the sun was already dipping low. The ride home was quiet, each of them absorbed in their thoughts. Eleanor was acutely aware of Caleb riding beside her, his profile silhouetted against the golden evening light. The confrontation with Reed had crystallized something for her, the fierce protectiveness she felt toward Caleb, toward Shadow Rock, toward the life she had built here. It wasn't mere gratitude or dependence, it was belonging. As they crested the final ridge before the ranch, Eleanor reined in her horse, taking in the view below. The cabin and outbuildings nestled against the backdrop of rugged mountains, smoke curling invitingly from the chimney where Sarah would be preparing dinner. The schoolhouse stood nearby, windows gleaming in the last rays of sunlight. Cattle grazed in the distant pastures, and the creek sparkled like a silver ribbon through the property. It's beautiful, she said softly. Caleb halted beside her, following her gaze. It's not much compared to what you could have in Boston. It's everything, she replied simply. His eyes shifted to her face, searching. Eleanor, not yet, she interrupted gently. I have things to tell you, but not here, not like this. After dinner, when we can speak privately, he nodded, accepting her request with characteristic patience. Sarah greeted them with warm food and concerned questions about their time in town. Eleanor answered briefly, sharing the confirmation of her inheritance, but not the confrontation with Reed. That story could wait. She didn't want to worry Sarah unnecessarily. After the meal, as Jake and Sarah prepared to retire to their cabin, Eleanor caught Caleb's eye. A walk, she suggested. I could use some fresh air. They strolled toward the creek in companionable silence, the evening cool but pleasant, stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Eleanor had rehearsed what she wanted to say a dozen times on the ride home, yet now that the moment had arrived, she found herself uncharacteristically nervous. They reached a flat boulder beside the water, one of Eleanor's favorite spots to sit and read during rare moments of leisure. Caleb gestured for her to sit, then settled beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. So, he said finally, $30,000. Yes. Eleanor traced patterns on the smooth stone surface with her fingertip. It seems my aunt was quite successful in her investments. You'll be going back to Boston then? She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. No, his brow furrowed in confusion. But your inheritance, the opportunities, can be managed from here, she completed. Mr. Harrington has arranged everything. The money is mine to use as I see fit, wherever I choose to live. Caleb was silent for a long moment, absorbing this information. And you choose to stay at Shadow Rock? Why? Because this is where I belong now. Eleanor took a deep breath, gathering her courage. When I came west, I was seeking independence, a chance to build a meaningful life on my own terms. I nearly lost everything, my freedom, my dignity, perhaps my life. You saved me from that fate, and in doing so, you gave me the very thing I had been seeking all along. Purpose. Your purpose was always teaching, he said quietly. What, you would have found your way to that eventually? Yes, but not like this. Not teaching children who truly need what I can offer. Not building something from nothing. She shifted slightly, turning more fully toward him. The inheritance changes my circumstances, but it doesn't change who I've become or what matters to me. It simply gives me the freedom to choose my path without financial constraints. And you're choosing Shadow Rock. His voice held a note of wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. I'm choosing the school I've built, the community I've joined. Eleanor paused, her heart pounding. And I'm choosing you, Caleb. If you'll have me, the words hung between them, irretrievable, transforming the very air they breathed. Caleb went utterly still, his eyes never leaving her face. Eleanor, he said finally, her name a rough whisper. You don't owe me this. You don't owe me anything. This isn't about debt, she insisted. It's about choice, my choice, freely made. These past months, working beside you, building a life here, I've come to care for you in ways I never expected. Ways that have nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with who you are. He looked down at his hands, calloused and weathered from years of hard work. I'm just a rancher, not educated like you, You're the most honorable man I've ever known, Eleanor interrupted. You gave everything you had to save a stranger because it was right. You've supported my independence even when it might have meant losing me. You face men like Reed without flinching, not for glory but for justice. She reached out, covering his hand with hers. How could I not love such a man? His head snapped up at the word love, his eyes widening. Yes, she confirmed softly. I love you, Caleb Wyatt. Not because you rescued me, but because of who you are every day since. Steady, principled, kind. Caleb turned his hand beneath hers, their fingers intertwining. I never dared hope, he admitted, voice rough with emotion. Even before the inheritance, you seemed too fine for a place like this, for a man like me. Then you've underestimated both yourself and what I truly value. Eleanor moved closer, emboldened by the warmth of his hand in hers. I don't want Boston drawing rooms or city comforts. I want this, the school, the ranch, the life we could build together. Together, he echoed, the word carrying a weight of possibility. Yes, as equals, partners in every sense. The moonlight silvered his features as he studied her, hope and caution warring in his expression. You're certain, even knowing Reed won't give up easily? Even knowing the winters are harsh and the work never ends? I'm certain, she replied without hesitation. The question is, what do you want, Caleb? You've spent so much time ensuring my freedom and happiness. What about your own? His free hand rose to her cheek, the touch gentle as a whisper. I want you, he said simply. I have since that day at the auction, though I hardly dared admit it even to myself, not as possession, but as companion, partner. Wife, and if you'll consider it. Eleanor's breath caught at the word wife. Is that a proposal, Mr. Wyatt? The smile that transformed his face was like sunrise after the longest night. Warm, radiant, full of promise. It is, Miss Shaw. Though I should warn you, I have little to offer but this ranch and my heart. As it happens, she replied, leaning closer, those are precisely the things I value most. When their lips finally met, the kiss held all the tenderness and certainty that words could not fully express. Eleanor felt something settle within her. A sense of rightness, of coming home in the truest sense. This was what freedom really meant. The ability to choose love on her own terms. They returned to the cabin hand in hand, their path lit by stars and shared purpose. Tomorrow would bring challenges, Reed's threats, the formal arrangements for her inheritance, plans for expanding the school. But tonight was for this newfound understanding, this bridge between past and future. Sarah took one look at their linked hands and beamed, while Jake pretended not to notice, though his pleased expression betrayed him. No explanations were necessary. In this small family they had formed, some truths were simply understood. Later, as Eleanor prepared for bed, she paused by the window, gazing out at Shadow Rock bathed in moonlight. 6 months ago, she had stood on an auction block, her future determined by the highest bidder. Now she stood in a home of her own choosing, her heart given freely to the man who had risked everything to save her. The irony was not lost on her. She had indeed gone to the highest bidder, but not in the way her captors had intended. Caleb had offered not money, but principle, not ownership, but partnership, not dominance, but respect. In doing so, he had bid for her freedom, never expecting anything in return. That she had chosen to give him her heart anyway was the perfect completion of a circle that had begun in darkness, but now shone with unimagined light. Morning brought news that rippled through the small community surrounding Shadow Rock. Reed's men had set fire to the Peterson homestead during the night, though fortunately the family had escaped unharmed. The implications were clear. Reed was escalating his campaign of intimidation. He's sending a message, Caleb said grimly as they gathered around the breakfast table. To me, to you, to anyone who stands against him. We should alert the marshal, Jake suggested. We will, Caleb agreed. But the law moves slowly out here, and Reed knows it. Eleanor listened to their discussion, her mind racing. The inheritance that had seemed like such a blessing now offered a different kind of opportunity. Leverage against a man who understood only power and money. I have an idea, she said suddenly, interrupting their strategizing. Reed wants control of the valley, yes? What if we give him a different kind of opposition? Three pairs of eyes turned to Eleanor, curiosity mingling with wariness. What kind of opposition? Caleb asked. Eleanor laid her hands flat on the table, a gesture that had become habitual when she was presenting an important lesson to her students. Reed understands power through ownership. He wants to control the valley by forcing smaller ranchers and homesteaders out. Her voice grew stronger, more confident as the plan crystallized in her mind. What if my inheritance could be used to thwart that strategy? You mean buy land? Jake asked, brow furrowed. Not just land, Eleanor clarified. I mean creating a cooperative, pooling resources to help the Petersons rebuild, purchasing foreclosed properties before Reed can claim them, establishing legal protections for the smaller holdings in the valley. Caleb leaned forward, interest kindling in his eyes. A ranchers' association. Exactly. Eleanor nodded eagerly. With my inheritance providing the financial foundation, we could create something Reed can't simply bully or buy his way through. It could work, Jake said slowly. Most folks around here are independent to a fault, but they're also practical. If joining forces means keeping their land, we'd need to approach them carefully, Caleb cautioned. Present it as strength through unity, not charity. Of course, Eleanor agreed. Osam, and we'd need legal counsel to structure everything properly. She paused, considering Mr. Harrington might not be the right attorney for this, but he could certainly recommend someone with experience in territorial law. As they continued refining the concept, Eleanor felt a growing sense of purpose. This wasn't just about defending Shadowrock or defying Reed. It was about building something meaningful for the entire community, a legacy that would endure long after the current conflicts had faded into history. There's something else, she said, her voice softening as she turned to Caleb. If we're to present a united front, our own situation should be formalized as well. His eyes met hers, understanding her meaning immediately. You're suggesting we marry sooner rather than later? Yes. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm, but kept her gaze steady. Not merely for appearances, but because I see no reason to wait, unless you have objections. The smile that transformed his face was answer enough, but his words confirmed it. No objections whatsoever, Miss Shaw. Sarah clapped her hands together in delight. A wedding. Oh, we'll need to prepare something simple, Eleanor interjected gently. Here at Shadow Rock with just our closest friends. And soon, Caleb added, his hand finding Eleanor's across the table. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Eleanor rode with Caleb to visit neighboring ranchers and homesteaders, presenting their vision for the cooperative. Some were immediately supportive, while others required more convincing, but gradually a coalition began to form. Mr. Harrington, true to his word, recommended a capable attorney from Denver who specialized in territorial land law. Eleanor commissioned him to draft the necessary documents for the Shadow Rock Valley Association, as they had decided to call it. Meanwhile, word of Eleanor's inheritance and her intention to use it in defense of the smaller landholders spread throughout the region. Reed's tactics of intimidation became increasingly ineffective as people realized they were no longer isolated and vulnerable. The Petersons rebuilt their homestead with help from a dozen neighbors, the new house rising from the ashes in less than a week. When Reed's men appeared to threaten them again, they found themselves confronted by a united group of ranchers, including Caleb and Jake. "You tell Reed that times are changing," Caleb had said to Reed's foreman, his voice carrying to all assembled. "The days of forcing people off their land are over. We stand together now." Word of the confrontation reached Reed quickly. His response was predictable: rage, followed by increasingly desperate attempts to reassert control. But with each failed intimidation, his influence diminished further. Through it all, Eleanor continued teaching her students. Now numbering 15 children from throughout the valley, the schoolhouse became a symbol of community resilience, a place where the future was being shaped through education rather than force. On a perfect autumn day, with the aspen trees gleaming gold against the deep blue sky, Eleanor Shaw became Eleanor Wyatt in a simple ceremony on the porch of Shadow Rock Ranch. She wore a new dress of cream-colored silk, her one concession to luxury from her inheritance. With wildflowers in her hair, Caleb, uncharacteristically nervous, wore a new black suit that made him look both distinguished and slightly uncomfortable. The entire valley turned out to witness their union. Ranchers and homesteaders, students and parents, even Mr. Harrington, who had traveled from Boston for the occasion. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing and more food than Eleanor had seen in one place since leaving the East. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the land, Eleanor and Caleb slipped away from the festivities to stand together on the ridge overlooking their property. "Happy?" Caleb asked, his arm around her waist, his voice a gentle rumble against her ear. Eleanor leaned into him, surveying the valley below, their home, their school, their future stretching out before them. "Completely," she replied. "Are you?" "More than I ever thought possible." He turned her gently to face him, his expression serious despite the joy of the day. "You know Reed isn't finished. The association has checked him for now. But men like that don't surrender easily." "I know," she acknowledged, "but we're prepared for whatever comes. Together, together," he agreed, the word a vow as binding as those they had exchanged earlier. As if summoned by their conversation, a cloud of dust appeared on the distant road, a single rider approaching at speed. Caleb tensed, immediately alert to potential threat. "Stay here," he instructed, already moving toward the main house where most of the guests remained. Eleanor ignored the directive, following close behind him. Whatever news this rider brought, they would face it as they had faced everything since their extraordinary beginning, side by side. The rider turned out to be young Tom Peterson, his face flushed with exertion. "Mr. Wyatt, Mrs. Wyatt," he called, dismounting in a clumsy rush. "News from town." By now, several guests had gathered, sensing drama unfolding on this already momentous day. "Catch your breath, boy," Jake advised. "Then tell us what's happened." Tom gulped air, then blurted, "It's Reed. The marshal arrested him this morning." A murmur ran through the crowd. Caleb stepped forward, his expression cautious. "On what charges?" "Fraud and land theft," Tom exclaimed. "Seems he's been forging documents, claiming properties that weren't rightfully his. The territorial governor sent investigators from Denver after receiving complaints." The boy's eyes shifted to Eleanor. "They say it was letters from a Boston-educated lady that finally got their attention." All eyes turned to Eleanor, who felt a flush rising in her cheeks. "I may have written to some authorities about certain irregularities I observed in land transactions," she admitted. "Mr. Harrington helped ensure the letters reached the right people." Caleb's surprised look gave way to admiration. "You never mentioned this." "I wasn't certain anything would come of it," she explained. "It seemed prudent to pursue multiple strategies." A cheer went up from the assembled guests as the news sank in. Reed's arrest meant more than justice for past wrongs. It represented hope for a future where intimidation no longer ruled the valley. As the celebration resumed with renewed vigor, Caleb drew Eleanor aside into the shelter of the porch where they had exchanged their vows just hours earlier. "You continue to amaze me," he said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Teacher, community organizer, strategic correspondent to territorial authorities. What other talents